It was my grandmother's 79th birthday. The family gathered, laughter filled the air, and the sweet aroma of cake wafted through the room. I thought perhaps she had finally found peace after years of endurance. But a single careless remark from her shattered everything. In a fit of rage, my father knocked over the birthday cake I'd brought, a cake I hoped would bring our family closer together. Frosting splattered, glasses shattered, and my grandmother sank to the floor in the middle of the room, her tears mingling with the murmurs of the guests. That night I led her out of that house, taking nothing but our shared humiliation and a resolve that she would never have to cry again. I never imagined that just a few years later someone would appear out of nowhere, bringing evidence that would force my entire family to bow their heads in guilt. Hello, my name is Beckett Hollis. I'm 30 years old, living in a tiny rented apartment in Salem, Oregon, where the faint smell of stale coffee from the downstairs neighbor seeps through my window every morning. My apartment isn't anything special, just 2 small rooms in an old building on the outskirts of Salem. The living room holds a worn-out sofa, a wooden table I found at a flea market, and a few family photos on a shelf. In the corner is a cramped kitchen, just big enough for an electric stove, an old fridge, and a handful of dishes. The bedroom is narrow but tidy, always carrying the faint scent of motor oil from my work clothes. To me, it's enough to call home, even if each day blends into the next. I work for Northline Logistics, a mid-sized transportation company. My job is driving delivery trucks, crisscrossing roads from small towns to bustling cities. It's tough, no doubt. Some days I leave before dawn and return when the clock strikes 10 at night, my legs aching and my back sore. But I don't complain. This job pays the rent, buys decent meals, and most importantly, gives me a reason to keep going each day. I'm not one for talking about myself. My coworkers at Northline call me quiet, but they like me, probably because I never refuse to help, whether it's sharing a bottle of water on a scorching day or staying late to check inventory with the team. I'm not good with flowery words, but I believe kindness is the only thing that makes this harsh world bearable. And if there's anything I'm proud of, it's that I've held on to my sincerity, even when life tries to crush it. My life is simple, almost repetitive, like an endless cycle. Wake up, drive, deliver, go home, sleep. But amid those long, tiring days, there's a bright spot I always look forward to. Visiting my grandmother in Eugene, about an hour's drive from Salem. Just thinking about sitting with her, hearing her laugh and smelling the warm apple pie from her oven makes everything in my life feel worthwhile. My grandmother Margaret is 78 years old. She lives with my grandfather Axel Hollis in a 2-story wooden house on the outskirts of Eugene. The house is old, its floorboards creaking with every step, but it's filled with a lifetime of memories. She's the gentlest woman I've ever known, with silver hair neatly tied back and warm brown eyes that seem to soothe any sorrow. Her entire life she's lived patiently beside my grandfather, a once renowned carpenter across the region, but also stern and cold in a way that sometimes makes me wonder how she endured him. He's not a bad man, but he has a strange way of showing affection. At times, he snaps for no reason, his voice booming like thunder, making the whole house tremble. When I was a kid, my parents sent me to stay with my grandparents every summer. Those were the best months of my memory. My grandmother took me to the Saturday farmers market, where stalls overflowed with ripe red apples, juicy tomatoes, and vibrant wildflowers. She taught me how to pick the sweetest apples, how to knead dough for pies, and told me fairy tales about knights and castles. Once, as she sat by the oven stroking my hair, she said, "Beckett, life can be harsh, but don't ever let it steal your kindness. People may yell or hurt you, but don't let them take the goodness in your heart." I nodded, not fully grasping her words then. But now, as an adult, I realize they've been my guiding light. On rainy evenings in Eugene, when the world seemed draped in a gray curtain of water, my grandmother and I would sit by the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. She'd talk about her youth, about meeting my grandfather, about learning to love a man who never spoke words of affection. I'd sit there, listening, feeling the warmth of her hand as she held mine. Once I asked why she never complained about him despite his occasional harshness. She just smiled, her eyes sparkling like an ocean. Because, Beckett, loving someone isn't about wanting them to change. It's about accepting them, even when they hurt you. Now, despite my busy job, I try to visit her at least every 2 weeks. The drive from Salem to Eugene has become a part of me. I love the feeling of my truck gliding past lush pine forests and winding roads leading into town. Each time I step into that wooden house smelling old wood and fireplace smoke, it's like returning to my childhood. My grandmother still greets me with a tight hug, though her hands tremble with age now. My grandfather remains the same, taciturn, but sometimes I catch him looking at her with a tenderness, as if trying to say something he's never voiced. Every dinner with them is a precious pause in my hectic life. The worn dining table, chipped plates, and my grandmother's oft-repeated stories about the old days, they all bring me peace. I look at her kind smile, and tell myself that as long as she's still smiling, my life has meaning. Even if everything else wears down, the aging wooden house, my grandfather's familiar sternness, as long as she's there, I feel fortunate. But life, as she once said, has a way of turning things harsh. I never imagined that just months after those warm dinners, her smile would vanish. A major upheaval was waiting, and it would change everything. From the wooden house in Eugene to my weekend visits to my very heart, which I thought was strong enough to withstand anything. It was a gray, frigid Tuesday morning, the kind of weather that made you want to stay wrapped in a blanket. I was driving on Highway 5 hauling a delivery from Portland to Salem when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled over to the shoulder and checked the screen. It was my mother, Deborah. Her voice on the other end trembled, unlike her usual calm demeanor. "Beckett, can you come to Eugene right away? Your grandfather, he's passed away." I stood frozen, my hand still gripping the phone. My grandfather, Axel Hollis, had died of a heart attack. The doctors said it was a recurrence after years of declining health. I wasn't surprised. He'd grown frail, his hands, once capable of carving wood into masterpieces, now trembling when holding a teacup. But even though I'd braced myself, the news hit like a punch to the chest. I quickly called my manager, took the day off, and sped toward Eugene, my heart heavy as the sky outside. When I arrived, the 2-story wooden house on the outskirts of Eugene was eerily silent. The front door was ajar, as if the house itself were mourning. My grandmother, Margaret, sat in the old armchair in the living room, her frail hands clasped tightly together. She wore a gray sweater, her silver hair neatly tied back as always, but her eyes, oh, those eyes, were empty and fathomless like a bottomless well. I approached, knelt before her, and took her hands. They were ice cold. "Grandma," I called softly, my voice catching. She looked at me, offering a faint smile, but it wasn't enough to hide the loneliness gnawing at her heart. "He's gone, Beckett," she said, her voice as light as a breeze. "Now it's just me." I wanted to say something comforting, but my throat tightened. I only squeezed her hands, hoping my warmth could fill even a fraction of the void my grandfather left behind. I knew she'd spent her life with a man who was cold, sometimes harsh, but she loved him in a way I never fully understood. And now, with him gone, I thought she might find peace, freedom after years of patience. But looking into her eyes, I saw only a profound sadness, as if part of her soul had left with him. The funeral took place a few days later at a small cemetery on the outskirts of Eugene, where rows of pine trees stood like silent sentinels. A light rain fell, soaking through my coat, chilling me to the bone. My grandfather's coffin, made of oak, the wood he'd loved as a carpenter, was placed amid a simple wreath of white flowers. Only a handful of people came to pay their respects. Some distant relatives, a few of his old friends and neighbors who knew him as a skilled but unapproachable craftsman. My grandmother stood by the coffin, her trembling hands placing a sprig of wildflowers on his chest, the kind she'd once said he liked but never admitted. Her gaze was quiet, tearless, but her shoulders trembled slightly as if holding back a tidal wave of emotion. I stood beside her, supporting her, feeling each of my own heavy breaths. I wasn't as close to my grandfather as I was to her, but seeing her there I felt an unnamed pain, as if I were losing not just him but a part of her. As the pastor read the prayer, I stole a glance at her. Her face was calm, but her eyes, usually sparkling like sunlight, were now clouded like the rainy sky. I realized her love for him had never faded despite its scars. "Grandma, are you okay?" I whispered as people began to leave. She took my hand, her voice soft. "I'm okay, Beckett. But he was my whole life." Those words tightened my chest. I hugged her, feeling her frail body tremble in my arms, and vowed to do everything to protect her. In the weeks that followed, my grandmother lived alone in the old house. She kept the same routines as when my grandfather was alive, waking early to make tea, tending the small vegetable garden out back, and sitting by the fireplace each evening with an old book. I tried to visit more often, sometimes just to sit with her, listening to the familiar stories I knew by heart. But each time I saw her, she seemed like a shadow, fragile and breakable. I ached for her, my heart stinging, but I didn't know how to pull her from that loneliness. I wasn't the only one visiting her in those early weeks after the funeral. My parents, Frank and Deborah Hollis, started coming by more often. My father, 58, was a senior manager at a bank in Salem. He always appeared polished. Crisp dress shirt, neatly tied tie, and a practiced, composed smile. He valued reputation and the image of success, always believing he knew what was right for the family. But behind that polished exterior was a conservative, prideful man willing to do anything to save face. My mother, Deborah, 55, was a former office worker who now managed the family's finances and joined local women's clubs, where she could boast about their spacious Salem home or short vacation trips. She was tactful, soft-spoken, but I knew she was pragmatic to the point of coldness. Every action was calculated, as if life were a balance sheet that needed to stay even. My parents lived about an hour from Eugene, in a large house with a manicured lawn and luxurious furnishings. Whenever they visited my grandmother, they brought flowers, fruit baskets, and sweet words of comfort that felt rehearsed. "Mom, you need to take care of yourself," my mother would say, gently touching her shoulder, her voice so tender I almost believed she meant it. My father would sit across from her, asking about trivial matters, as if proving he was a dutiful son. But one day, when I visited my grandmother, I overheard my mother make a suggestion that stopped me cold. "Mom, it's too lonely for you to live here alone," she said, her voice as gentle as ever. "Why don't you move to Salem with us? Our house is big, we'll take good care of you." My father nodded, adding, "She's right, Mom. This house is too big for you to manage alone. Come live with us. It'll be much easier." I looked at my grandmother, waiting for her response. She smiled, but it was a polite one. "Thank you," she said slowly, "but I want to stay here. This house holds my memories with your father. This land belonged to our ancestors. I don't want to trouble you." Hearing her words, my parents exchanged a silent glance and left, but I didn't anticipate that they wouldn't give up so easily. In the weeks that followed, they visited more frequently, each time repeating the suggestion with increasing pressure. My mother began talking about the dangers of an elderly person living alone, from falling downstairs to having no one to care for her when sick. My father spoke of the cost of maintaining the house, urging her to think about the future. They painted a perfect picture of life in Salem, where she'd be cared for, loved, and free of worries. But I saw through their sweet words to the relentless pressure beneath. One time, while I was sitting with my grandmother in the kitchen, my mother called. I heard her voice through the speaker, gentle but sharp. "Mom, have you thought it over? We only want what's best for you." My grandmother looked at me, a trace of weariness in her eyes, but she only shook her head slightly. "I'm fine," she said, as if reassuring both me and herself. But I knew the pressure from my parents was growing. Each time they visited, she smiled less, her eyes growing heavier. I began to worry, not just about her loneliness, but about a creeping sense that something was quietly changing. In the days that followed, my grandmother Margaret, with her boundless patience, initially resisted. "I'm used to this place," she said, her voice gentle but firm. I want to stay. But my parents weren't ones to give up easily. They shifted tactics, mixing persuasion with subtle blame. You keep insisting on staying here and we're so worried, my mother said, her voice tinged with hurt. We just want you to live comfortably, not struggle like this. My father was blunter. Think about us for a moment, Mom. We can't keep running back and forth like this. I could see my grandmother growing weary. Each time I visited, she tried to smile, but her eyes hid an unnamed sadness. Then one day when I came to see her, she called me into the living room. On the table sat a cold cup of tea and a document covered in signatures. I've agreed, she said, her voice calm but her eyes avoiding mine. I'll sell this house and move to Salem with your parents. I stood frozen, as if someone had slapped me hard across the face. Grandma, why would you? I trailed off, unsure of what to say. She took my hand, her frail fingers cold. I don't want my son to worry. I'm old, Beckett. I don't want to be a burden to anyone. I wanted to protest, to tell her she could never be a burden, that this house was where she belonged. But looking into her eyes, I knew she'd made up her mind. She was doing this not because she wanted to, but because she loved my father, loved me and feared her presence would trouble us. I could only hug her, holding her tightly as if trying to preserve the warmth of days gone by. The sale of the house happened quickly. The 2-story wooden house, the small plot with the vegetable garden she'd tended for years, was sold to a young family from Portland. The proceeds, substantial, were split evenly between her 2 children, my father, Frank, and his sister, Ava, who lived in Europe. I didn't know much about Aunt Ava, only that she'd left the U.S. long ago and rarely kept in touch. After the paperwork was finalized, my grandmother moved in with my parents in their spacious home on the outskirts of Salem. Their house was bright, with silk curtains and gleaming furniture, a world apart from the creaky wooden house in Eugene. I visited her the first day she moved in, my heart a mix of worry and hope. When I arrived, my mother was setting up her room, spreading fresh sheets, while my father stood in the kitchen talking about preparing a special dinner. My grandmother sat on the sofa wearing a pale green sweater, looking around the unfamiliar space. Are you okay, Grandma? I asked, sitting beside her. She smiled, this time a genuine one. I'm fine, Beckett. Don't worry. At first, everything seemed peaceful. My mother cared for her diligently, preparing hearty meals, doing her laundry, and even buying her a new armchair for reading. My father, despite his busy schedule at the bank, made time to eat dinner with her, asking about her health and sharing childhood stories, ones I knew he repeated to make her happy. Sometimes they took her on outings to a nearby park or short trips to the Oregon coast. My mother took family photos, posting them on social media with proud captions. Happy family. Taking care of Mom is our joy. Seeing those photos with my grandmother's radiant smile, I felt a weight lift from my heart. She ate better, laughed more, and seemed to have regained some light in her eyes. Each time I visited, I found her sitting in the corner of the living room, holding a book or a cup of tea, her face serene. See, I'm fine, she said, her voice soothing my worries. I began to believe I'd been overly concerned. Maybe this was the right choice. Maybe after years of enduring my grandfather, she was finally living in the care and love she deserved. I watched her, saw my mother meticulously folding her clothes, saw my father joking during their stories, and thought I'd been wrong to doubt them. I believed she had found peace, but I didn't know that this warmth was only surface deep. Beneath the facade of perfect dinners, outings, and social media photos, cracks were beginning to form. They were small, silent, like fissures in thin glass, but enough to stir an uneasy premonition in me. Looking back, I still remember those early days, when everything seemed peaceful. Each time I visited, I saw my grandmother sitting in my parents' bright living room holding a cup of tea, her face seemingly more radiant. My mother, Deborah, was always bustling around her, bringing a plate of freshly baked cookies or adjusting the blanket on her chair. My father, Frank, made time to sit and talk with her, recounting old stories of when she took him fishing on the Willamette River. The family photos taken at Thanksgiving dinners made me think things were on the right track. But then cracks began to appear, small but sharp, like needles pricking my heart. The first time I noticed something was wrong was during a late-night call to check on her after work. Her voice was weaker, slower than usual. "Yes, I'm fine, Beckett. Don't worry. How's your job?" When I pressed further, she quickly changed the subject, then found an excuse to end the call. "I need to water the plants," she said, though I knew the small garden at my parents' house didn't need her care. I hung up, my heart heavy, but told myself she was just tired from old age. Then one day I dropped by unannounced. As I knocked on the door, I heard my mother's voice from the kitchen, sharp and cold. "Mom, you forgot to clear the dishes after dinner again. I've told you so many times to do it right away or we'll get ants." I stepped inside and saw my grandmother standing in the corner of the kitchen holding a dish towel, her eyes downcast like a scolded child. I froze, feeling as if someone had poured ice water over me. My mother turned, saw me, and immediately flashed a smile. "Beckett, you're here. Come in, I'm baking." But my grandmother's eyes, distant and sorrowful, were impossible to ignore. I wanted to ask, to say something, but she shook her head slightly, as if pleading with me not to complicate things. Another time, during a dinner visit, I witnessed my father, Frank, lose his temper. My grandmother accidentally dropped a glass cup, and the sound of it shattering echoed in the quiet kitchen. My father, reading the newspaper at the dining table, slammed it down, his voice harsh. "Mom, can you be more careful? That glass wasn't cheap." She flinched, her trembling hands picking up the shards. I stood to help her, but my mother quickly stepped in, her voice soft but cold. "Leave it, Mom. I'll clean it up. Go rest." The air in the kitchen was heavy as lead, and I saw my grandmother's eyes, no longer the warm gaze I knew, but a deep sadness, as if she were trying to hide from the world. Phone calls with her weren't the same anymore. Her voice grew quieter, wearier, and our conversations often ended after a few sentences. "I'm fine, Beckett," she'd always say. But I could hear the tremor in her voice, as if she were holding something back. Once during a call, I overheard my father shouting in the background, followed by her trembling, faint apology. "I'm sorry, Frank, I didn't mean to." I asked immediately, "Grandma, what's going on? Is something wrong?" But she cut me off quickly. "Must be a bad signal, Beckett. I'll hang up now, we'll talk another time." I put down the phone, my heart pounding, feeling a weight like a stone pressing on my chest. I began to realize that the warmth I'd trusted was just a fragile facade. My parents, whom I thought would care for her diligently, were starting to see her as a burden. The family dinners, the outings, the social media photos. It was all a carefully staged performance to hide the truth. I saw my mother still smiling in those posts, still speaking sweet words in my presence. But my grandmother's eyes told a different story. She grew quieter, told fewer stories, and her smile, the smile that had been my light, was now just a faint shadow. The uneasy premonition within me grew stronger. Each time I left my parents' house, I felt like I was abandoning her in a place where she didn't truly belong. I wanted to do something, to take her away from there, but I didn't know where to start. I feared that if I intervened, I'd shatter the fragile piece she was trying to hold on to. But deep down, I knew that if I didn't act, she would be hurt again. This time, not by my grandfather's coldness, but by the very people she called her children. My grandmother Margaret's 79th birthday was approaching, and I decided it would be an opportunity to bring her some joy. I wanted to see her smile, truly smile, like the days we spent by the oven baking apple pies in Eugene. I ordered a large cake from a favorite bakery in Salem, a vanilla cake with smooth white frosting adorned with delicate sugar flowers. I pictured her loving it, smiling as she blew out the candles and perhaps for that moment forgetting the silent sorrows gnawing at her. I called my mother, asking her to host a small party at their house. "Mom, I want Grandma's birthday to be special," I said, my voice full of hope. "I'll bring the cake. Can you prepare some food and invite a few close neighbors?" My mother agreed immediately, her voice as sweet as ever. "Of course, Beckett. I'll take care of everything. Grandma will be so happy." On the day of the birthday, I drove to my parents' house, the cake carefully placed on the passenger seat, the faint scent of vanilla filling the car and making me smile. When I stepped inside, everything was perfectly arranged. The dining table draped in white silk, plates of food elegantly displayed, and a vibrant vase of yellow daisies at the center. A few close neighbors were already there, chatting lively in the living room. As I entered, my grandmother, seated in her armchair, looked up at me. Her gentle smile warmed my heart. "Beckett, you're here," she said, her voice soft but brighter than usual. I set the cake on the table, hugged her tightly, feeling the fragile warmth of her body. For the first time in months, she seemed like herself again, the kind grandmother who always made me feel at home. The party began in a festive mood. My mother bustled about, ensuring everyone had drinks and food, her smile as perfect as in her social media photos. My father stood in a corner talking to a neighbor about his job at the bank, his voice confident, as if he were delivering a speech. "I got a promotion last month," he said, holding a glass of wine, his eyes gleaming with pride. "But taking care of Mom is still the top priority. Family is everything, right?" The guests nodded, and I looked at my grandmother, hoping she could feel some joy from the atmosphere. My mother was no less enthusiastic. She talked about their recent trip to Cannon Beach, where the family had taken perfect photos. "We wanted Mom to relax," she said, resting a hand lightly on my grandmother's shoulder as if playing a role in an idealized family drama. I sat beside my grandmother, watching her smile, but her smile now seemed slightly forced. I told myself I was overthinking, that today was a happy day and everything would be fine. But then things began to veer off course. During a conversation with a neighbor, my father started complaining about rising costs. "Everything's so expensive these days," he said, his voice lowering. "I have to save more, balancing work and taking care of Mom. It's not easy." I saw my grandmother pause, her eyes flicking toward him, then down to the table. Then she spoke, her voice full of concern. "But Frank, I sold the house and land in Eugene and split it evenly between you and Ava. Why are you still so worried?" The room fell silent. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, all stopped as if someone had pressed a pause button. Guests exchanged glances, some whispering, their eyes curious. My mother's face flushed, her hand gripping her wine glass so tightly I feared it would shatter. My father forced a smile, but it was strained, laced with anger. "Mom, don't bring up private matters in front of others," he said, his voice cold as ice, though I saw his hand tremble. My grandmother froze, her eyes confused. I just," she stammered, unable to finish. The atmosphere grew stifling and I felt my blood boil. My father, as if unable to bear the embarrassment, slammed his hand on the table. The sound startled everyone. "Enough!" he shouted, his eyes blazing. Then in a moment I'll never forget, he swung his arm, knocking the birthday cake off the table. The white frosting splattered, sugar flowers shattered on the floor, and the sweet vanilla scent now felt bitter. My grandmother burst into tears, her sobs tearing at my heart. She covered her face, her shoulders shaking with shame and heartbreak under the curious stares of the neighbors. I stood abruptly, my blood surging with rage. "Dad, what are you doing?" I yelled, my voice breaking with anger. My mother stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "Beckett, calm down. Your father's just a bit upset." But I couldn't calm down. I looked at my grandmother, the woman who had spent her life loving and sacrificing, now crying like a child in front of everyone. I turned to my father, his eyes still burning with anger. He shouted, "You think you're so great now, huh? Then take her and care for her yourself. Let's see how long you last." His words cut like a knife. I looked at him, at my mother, then at the awkward guests, unsure of what to do. I said nothing more. I walked to my grandmother, gently helping her stand. "Grandma, come with me," I said, my voice hoarse. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she nodded, letting me lead her out of the house. My mother's calls and my father's muttering faded like wind in my ears. I left behind the ruined party, the wrecked cake on the floor, and a family I once thought was a safe haven for her. On the drive back to my apartment in Salem, my grandmother sat beside me, silent, clutching a tear-soaked handkerchief. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart aching. I knew from that moment I would not let her endure any more pain. I would bring her to live with me no matter what challenges lay ahead. My small apartment in Salem wasn't an ideal place to start a new life. It was cramped, with peeling walls and a worn-out sofa I'd picked up at a flea market. My salary from driving deliveries for Northline Logistics barely covered my own expenses, so when my grandmother Margaret moved in, things became tighter than ever. Those first months were tough. I cut every unnecessary expense, from eating out to fixing my old truck. I remember nights sitting on the sofa listening to my grandmother shift in the small bedroom, where I'd given her the only bed. I stared at the ceiling, its cracks like the lines of a harsh fate, wondering if I was strong enough to care for her the way she deserved. Once I caught her skipping breakfast to save food for me, claiming she wasn't hungry. I was angry at myself, angry that I couldn't give her a better life. But each time I tried to apologize, she'd take my hand, her eyes gentle. "Beckett, having you here is enough. I don't need anything more." Those simple words were like a small flame warming my heart. But amid those hardships, I found something money couldn't buy. Simple joy. My grandmother began to smile again, however faintly, and our tiny apartment slowly became a true home. Every morning, she'd wake early to make coffee for me, despite my pleas for her to rest. She planted small pots of herbs on the windowsill, tending them as she once did her garden in Eugene. Some evenings, we'd sit together eating modest meals, sometimes just pasta with tomato sauce. Her laughter, soft but warm, filled the apartment like a song soothing my heart. Those moments, though simple, gave me strength to keep going. I worked harder, taking extra night shifts to earn more, even when my body was so exhausted I'd doze off at red lights. I fixed up the apartment bit by bit, buying a new fan for the sweltering summer, a rug to warm the floor in winter, and even finding an old but cozy armchair for her to read in. Each time I saw her smile, every effort felt worthwhile. She wasn't just family. She was the flame keeping me steady through tough days. 3 years passed and our life stabilized. I was promoted to delivery team leader with a slight pay raise that let me buy her a new bed and spruce up the apartment. I cut off all contact with my parents, ignoring their calls and messages. Whenever I thought of them, I saw the shattered birthday cake on the floor and my grandmother's tears. I didn't want their memories tainting the peaceful days I was building with her. Then one day, after a long shift, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a middle-aged woman with curly brown hair and a friendly smile. "Beckett," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Ava, your aunt." I was stunned. Ava Hollis, my father's sister, whom I knew only through my grandmother's stories, stood at my door. My grandmother, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, leapt up, her eyes shining. "Ava, my girl," she called, her voice choked with emotion. They embraced, tears streaming down my grandmother's cheeks. I stood there watching, feeling as if a forgotten piece of our family had returned. Ava retained the warmth and kindness my grandmother had described. She wore an elegant wool coat, but there was no air of flaunting success. We sat in my small living room and she asked about my grandmother's health in the past few years. My grandmother smiled, talking about her window herbs and my hard work. "Beckett's a good grandson," she said, taking my hand, her eyes full of pride. I smiled, but my heart remained heavy, thinking of what she'd endured. Ava turned to me, asking about my job and life. Then she mentioned my parents, her tone gentle but curious. "I stopped by Frank's house before coming here," she said. "They told me Mom was staying with you for a few days to cheer up." I froze, a chill running down my spine. My grandmother lowered her head, silent. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told Ava everything, from how my parents pressured her to sell the Eugene house, to their scolding and the horrific birthday when my father knocked over the cake in front of everyone. Ava listened, her face paling, her eyes widening in shock. "No way," she whispered, covering her mouth. Then Ava shared a story that left my grandmother and me speechless. She pulled out her phone, showing a series of texts and bank statements. "Over the past year, Frank kept texting and calling me," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He said caring for Mom was expensive, that she was gravely ill, needing hospital bills and medication. He asked me to send money monthly to help." She handed us the phone. My father's messages appeared, filled with complaints about the cost of caring for her, paired with thanks when Ava sent money. The bank statements showed she'd sent over $100,000, a sum I couldn't fathom. My grandmother covered her face, tears streaming again. "Why would he do this to me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I clenched my fists, feeling my blood boil. My parents hadn't just taken advantage of her, forcing her to sell her home, but had deceived Ava, their own sister, profiting from her filial devotion. The truth was worse than anything I'd imagined. The air in the small apartment grew heavy, as if shrouded in a dark fog. Ava looked at my grandmother, her eyes resolute. "Mom, I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," she said firmly, "but I promise it's time for everything to be brought to light." I had never seen Ava like this, a woman who seemed gentle but now radiated a sharp, unyielding determination. She sat across from me and my grandmother in my small apartment, holding a thick stack of documents. Bank statements, text messages, and printed emails, all undeniable proof of my father Frank's deception. "We have to confront them," Ava said, her voice low but resolute. "Not just for the money, but for what they've done to Mom." My grandmother sat beside me, her frail hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor as if trying to shrink away from the painful truth. I nodded, though my heart was flooded with both anger and fear. I knew this confrontation wouldn't be easy, but I also knew we couldn't let things continue like this. That morning, the Salem sky was gray with a light rain falling like silent tears. Ava drove, I sat beside her, and my grandmother was in the back, silent throughout the trip to my parents' house in the suburbs. Their spacious, impeccably manicured home now felt cold, like a perfect painting lacking warmth. When we knocked, my mother, Deborah, opened the door, her familiar smile freezing when she saw all three of us standing there. "Mom, Ava, Beckett," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Why are you all here together?" My father appeared behind her, his face briefly flustered before he regained his composed demeanor. "Come in," he said, his tone forcefully friendly, but I noticed his eyes flicker warily toward Ava. We entered the living room, the same room where that horrific birthday party had taken place. The air was heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath. My grandmother sat on the sofa, her trembling hands resting on her lap. Ava stood tall, placing the stack of documents on the table, her voice calm but cutting. "Frank, Deborah, I'm here to talk about money. Specifically, the money you asked me to send to care for Mom." My father frowned, forcing a strained smile. "Ava, what are you talking about?" There must be some misunderstanding. But Ava didn't let him interrupt. She opened the folder, flipping through pages of bank statements and text messages he'd sent, her voice steady but powerful. "For the past year, you've taken over $100,000 from me, claiming it was for hospital bills, medication, and Mom's care. But Mom's here, living with Beckett, healthy and never receiving a cent from you. So, where did that money go?" The room fell into a stifling silence. My mother bowed her head, her hands clutching the edge of her shirt, while my father's face paled, his eyes wavering. I looked at my grandmother and saw silent tears streaming down her cheeks. She sat like a statue, her gaze fixed on my father, the son she had loved so dearly. I wanted to hug her, to say something to ease her pain, but the anger boiling inside me held me back. My father, after a few seconds of silence, finally lowered his head, his voice soft. "All right, I admit it. I used the money to pay off bank debts and some other expenses. My mother burst into tears, but not out of remorse. I saw shame in her eyes, as if she only regretted being caught. I stood, unable to hold back any longer. Dad, Mom, you didn't just pressure Grandma to sell her house or break her heart. You lied to Aunt Ava. You call that family? My voice broke, torn between fury and heartbreak. I looked at my father, the man who once taught me about honor, now unable to meet my eyes. Their greed and pride had stripped them of all dignity, and it felt like my heart was being crushed. Ava remained calm, her voice cold but resolute. I don't want apologies. I want you to repay every cent you took with a legally binding agreement. My mother sobbed harder, pleading, Ava, please, we didn't mean to. We were just in a tough spot. But Ava shook her head. No hardship justifies deceiving family. She slid a document toward them, a contract requiring repayment of over $100,000 within 24 months, at $4,200 per month starting the following month. My parents reluctantly signed, their hands trembling as they put pen to paper. Ava looked at me, then at my grandmother, and said, all of this money, once repaid, will go to Beckett. It's compensation for the years he's cared for and protected Mom. I was stunned, not expecting this, but my heart wasn't filled with joy. I felt only a deep pain, as if the family I once trusted had shattered forever. The confrontation ended in silence. No more accusations, no more arguments. Just cold glances between people who once called each other family. I helped my grandmother stand, guiding her to the car, feeling her body tremble with each step. Ava walked beside us, her hand tightly holding my grandmother's as if lending her strength. As we left the house, I glanced back one last time, seeing my parents standing at the door, their faces like ghosts in the dim light of the rainy afternoon. After that day, my parents' lives, Frank and Deborah's, began to crumble. The news of what they'd done, forcing my grandmother to sell her house, exploiting Aunt Ava's filial devotion for profit, spread quickly among relatives. Aunts, uncles, and neighbors who once admired them now whispered behind their backs, their eyes filled with reproach. To mistreat their own mother like that, who would have thought? I overheard a relative say during a chance encounter at the supermarket. The honor my father had always prized, built on crisp suits and tales of success, dissipated like morning mist. Their spacious suburban Salem home grew quiet and cold. The silk curtains were no longer drawn each morning, the lawn no longer meticulously trimmed. My parents faced crushing financial pressure, repaying bank loans from past debts while transferring $4,200 monthly to cover the money they'd swindled from Ava. I don't know how they managed, but I heard they sold a car and some expensive furniture. The two people who once lived in the glow of perfection were now depleted, carrying belated regret that no one cared to hear. Meanwhile, Ava stayed in the U.S. for a few more weeks. She spent time with my grandmother, taking her on walks around Salem to small parks she loved, or simply sitting together in my apartment, reminiscing about old times. I saw my grandmother slowly regain some light in her eyes, though the pain from my father's actions lingered. Ava, with her warmth and resolve, became a great comfort to her. One evening, as the three of us sat around the table with a plate of apple pie my grandmother had baked, Ava spoke up, her voice gentle but determined. Mom, I want you to come live with me in France. My grandmother and I both froze. She set down her spoon, her eyes flickering with confusion. France? She asked softly. I'm old, Ava. I don't want to leave my homeland. Ava took her hand, her gaze kind but firm. Mom, I want to take care of you, the way you took care of me and Frank all those years. In Lyon, I have a small house with a flower garden, and I'll be with you every day. I saw my grandmother hesitate, her eyes drifting to me as if seeking my approval. But what about Beckett? She said, her voice catching. Ava smiled, turning to me. Beckett's a wonderful grandson, but I want him to have his own life, Mom. He's done so much for you already. I sat there, feeling my heart constrict. The thought of her leaving me, moving halfway across the world, made me want to protest. But when I looked into her eyes, full of love but also exhaustion. I knew Ava was right. I'd spent 3 years protecting her, but I wanted her to have a comfortable life, not cramped in my tiny apartment worrying about piling bills. "Grandma, if you want to go, I'll support you," I said, though each word felt like a cut. She took my hand, her eyes glistening with tears. "You're my pride, Beckett," she said, her voice trembling. Before leaving the U.S., Ava did something I never expected. One morning, she handed me a thick envelope. "This is $300,000, she said, her voice calm but meaningful. "This isn't just money. It's my gratitude for you for taking care of Mom when no one else did." I shook my head, trying to refuse, but Ava placed a hand on my shoulder. "You deserve it, Beckett. Use it to build your life, the way you've rebuilt hers." I took the envelope, feeling it was heavier than the money inside, carrying both my grandmother's love and the responsibility I knew I had to bear. On the day I saw her off at Portland International Airport, the sky was clear, but my heart felt like lead. She wore a pale green sweater and the scarf I'd given her last year. I held her hand for a long time, feeling every wrinkle on her frail fingers. "Grandma, you have to live happily, okay?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled, the gentle smile I'd always cherished. "Beckett, live kindly and don't let your heart turn to stone," she said, her voice soft but certain, like a final piece of advice. As she and Ava disappeared beyond the security gate, I stood still amid the bustling crowd, feeling as if a part of my heart had left forever. Yet strangely, I felt at peace. I knew she would be loved and cared for, and that was all I'd ever wanted. After that day, I stood at a new crossroads. In my hands was the $300,000 from Aunt Ava, a sum I'd never dared to dream of. But more than money, it was a reminder from my grandmother and Ava that I deserved a better life, not just for myself, but for what I believed in. I decided to use the money to start my own venture, to build something that bore my mark. I founded Hollis Freight and Logistics, a small transportation company named after my grandmother, who taught me that kindness and perseverance could overcome any hardship. The early days were tougher than I'd imagined. I bought 2 used trucks, but they broke down constantly, forcing me to repair them late at night, my hands stained with grease. Contracts were scarce, clients canceled at the last minute, and operating costs ate up nearly all my capital. Some weeks I worked from dawn to midnight, driving, delivering, and handling paperwork. There were moments I thought I'd go bankrupt, when a driver quit abruptly or a major client pulled out. I sat in my tiny office, really just a corner of my apartment, staring at piled-up bills, wondering if I was on the wrong path. But I didn't give up. Each time I felt like quitting, I thought of my grandmother, her patience tending a barren garden, her words about kindness. I built my reputation bit by bit. I delivered on time, listened to clients, and kept my promises. Slowly, small contracts came, then larger ones. I bought a new truck, then 2 more. I hired more staff, including young men from tough backgrounds who reminded me of myself in those early struggling days. I taught them to drive, handle cargo, and most importantly, treat others with kindness. Seeing them smile when they got their first paycheck felt like giving something back to the world. Hollis Freight and Logistics grew. After 2 years, the company had a small but steady fleet, a loyal client base, and a proper office on the outskirts of Salem. I bought a new house, not grand but cozy, with a small garden where I planted daisies to remember my grandmother. I also got a new truck, no longer worrying about breakdowns mid-route. Then, while working with a major client in Salem, I met Claire, a bright, smiling accountant with a warm voice. She helped me untangle the chaotic numbers I never had time to organize. We spent afternoons together, surrounded by cold coffee and stacks of paperwork. I don't know when our conversations shifted from revenue and invoices to something more. Claire shared stories of her childhood in Bend, of her mother working 3 shifts to raise her. I told her about my grandmother, about our years in the tiny apartment. Something in her eyes made me feel understood, as if she saw the world of hurt behind my calm exterior. One late evening, after finishing a report together, I drove her home. Before she got out, she paused, smiling. "Beckett, you should smile more. You look so much lighter when you do." I don't know where I found the courage, but I replied softly, "If you're around, maybe I will." She laughed, and that laugh eased an entire day's fatigue. From then on, we saw each other more, at coffee shops, on delivery routes. Our relationship grew naturally, like breathing. For the first time in years, I dared to imagine a future not just of work and duty, but of love. My life, once a monotonous cycle of exhausting drives, became full, like a painting I'd never dared to create. But just when I thought things had stabilized, one afternoon my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find my parents, Frank and Deborah. They were dressed shabbily, no trace of their once polished clothes or confident smiles. My father had grown thinner, his hair flecked with gray, while my mother looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed. "Beckett," my father said, his voice hoarse, "can we talk for a moment?" I let them in, but my heart was cold. They sat on the sofa, hands clasped, and began recounting their hardships. They'd sold nearly everything: the second car, an antique dining set, even part of their suburban land, to pay off bank debts and Ava's money. "We know we were wrong," my mother said, tears streaming down her face. "We just want your forgiveness. And if you can, please tell Ava we've paid enough so we don't have to keep paying." My father nodded, his voice low. "You're doing well now, Beckett. We're broke. Can you help us? Maybe send some money monthly?" I sat silently, listening to their pleas. They didn't anger me. They left me empty. Before me were two strangers, no longer the parents I once respected. I took a deep breath, my voice calm. "Everyone has to take responsibility for their actions. I can't help you." I wasn't angry or bitter, just aware of an unbridgeable gap between us. My parents left in silence, their eyes dazed, carrying the ruins of their pride. I watched through the window as their figures faded down the quiet street. I felt neither joy nor sorrow, only a sense that my heart had closed off the past for good. They never came back. The stormy years have passed, but they left scars that will never fully heal. I once thought justice meant watching those who wronged others pay a price, seeing them suffer as they had caused suffering. But standing in my new home, with a garden of blooming daisies outside the window, I realized true justice doesn't come from revenge. It comes from how you live, honestly, kindly, and without letting your heart be tainted by resentment. My grandmother taught me that, not through words, but through the way she lived, the way she smiled despite life's harshness, the way she loved even when hurt. Looking back on the journey, I recall the evenings and mornings filled with memories, the days my grandmother and I squeezed into my tiny apartment, the nights I worked to exhaustion building Hollis Freight and Logistics, the moment I stood at Portland Airport watching her leave. Each step of that journey taught me that love doesn't need grand promises or glossy social media photos. Love is action. Holding her in that cold kitchen after the ruined birthday party, spending every hard-earned penny to give her a warm bed, standing up for her even if it meant losing the family I once called home. What I did for her was the greatest reward, reminding me that I lived true to her teachings, to be kind no matter how cruel the world. I learned bitter but necessary lessons. Not everyone labeled family knows how to love. My parents, once my models of success, chose ambition and greed over kinship. They lost my grandmother, Aunt Ava, and ultimately me. Filial piety, I realized, isn't just providing money or superficial care. It's protecting loved ones from harm, standing up when they're treated unjustly, preserving the light in their hearts even when darkness surrounds them. From the success of Hollis Freight and Logistics, I decided to do something to honor my grandmother and her lessons. I founded a small fund called the Margaret Hollis Foundation, dedicated to lonely elderly people and those caring for aging parents in hardship. The fund isn't large, but it's my way of giving back, ensuring people like my grandmother, who spent their lives sacrificing, aren't left alone or forgotten. Each time I sign a check for the fund, I recall her words. Beckett, everyone deserves to be treated with kindness. I want to live by those words, not just for her, but for myself. On her birthdays, I video call her in France, where she lives in a small house in Lyon with Aunt Ava. Through the screen, I see her sitting by a window, golden sunlight illuminating her silver hair. Her gentle laughter, familiar as the old days, rings through the phone speaker, warming my heart. "Are you doing well, Grandma?" I ask, though I know the answer. "I'm fine, dear," she says, her eyes sparkling. "And you live kindly." Those calls are the thread connecting me to her, to the days I'll always cherish. I no longer resent my parents. Instead, I pity them, people who lost everything because they didn't know how to love rightly. They live in their cold suburban Salem house, imprisoned by regret and debts, not just financial but human. I don't know how they're faring, but I choose not to let the past define me. I choose to live as my grandmother taught me, with kindness, no matter how life tries to steal it. Sometimes justice comes late, but it comes not through accusations or retribution, but through how we choose to live kindly. Money can vanish, fame can fade, but kindness endures. I stand in the office of Hollis Freight and Logistics, looking at a framed photo on the wall. My grandmother, Aunt Ava, and me, taken one afternoon in Salem when we were still laughing together. I smile faintly, the smile of someone who's weathered storms but kept the light in their heart. Heart, 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 heart,